Since it's October, my favoriteest month of the year, I thought I would cover one of the more gruesome cases I've written about that didn't actually involve homicide. I'm talking about International Biological Incorporated, a very innocuous name, but a case that was so disgusting and so shocking, it was called the Warehouse of Horrors. Let's get into it. First, to all my subscribers and any newcomers and darklings of all kinds, welcome. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Today we're going to be talking about Art Rathburn's Warehouse of Horrors. And I'm going to give a content warning that there's some pretty graphic descriptions of human remains. So just be warned. The sordid story of Art Rathburn begins in 1984. When he became the coordinator of the University of Michigan's anatomical donation program, which is where people would donate their bodies to the college's medical school. But in 1990, he was either fired or quit. It's unclear because he sued to have his personnel records sealed. But according to some reporting at the time, it sounds like he got busted illegally selling parts of those donated cadavers. And in fact, the year before that, 1989, he had begun his own independent body brokerage. And this is where we need to explain exactly what a body brokerage is. When you donate your body to science, it goes through something called a non-transplant human tissue bank, also known as a body brokerage. As long as the deceased or their next of kin signs the proper consent forms and the tissue is tested and found to be free of disease, then the body broker can basically sell these remains to anyone with a valid credit card. The majority of the buyers, as you can guess, are in the medical field. Cadavers and their individual parts are used by doctors and surgeons to practice on, and the various tissues are used by researchers to study drugs and diseases. The Department of Defense also uses cadavers and individual body parts in its destructive tests. Landmines. If you're interested in the many ways that your body can be used if you donate it to science, I highly recommend this book, Stiff by Mary Roach. It's incredibly informative and surprisingly hilarious, and is one of the reasons that I'm such a big fan of Mary Roach. I'll put a link in the description. I highly recommend you check this out. Now, body brokerage is a very lucrative industry. An entire intact cadaver can go for $5,000 and up. And if it's parted out, so to speak, it can go for a lot more than that. But there are few to no regulations on the industry. Only 10 states have any regulations at all, and most of them are rarely enforced. The closest thing to any kind of oversight on the industry is the voluntary accreditation process through the American Association of Tissue Banks. That's a nonprofit that sets standards for the safety and use of human tissue. But it's not a regulatory body, and it has no power to enforce its standards. Anyway, back to Arthur Rathburn. His questionable side hustle body brokerage went bankrupt in 2007. Which is the same year that he and his wife, Elizabeth, opened a new body brokerage, this one called International Biological Inc., or IBI. They ran IBI out of this really sketchy warehouse on Detroit's east side, and they purchased bodies from a variety of sources, like overseas sellers, where there are even less regulations on human body trade, other body brokers here in the United States, and of course, funeral homes. The Rathburns then sold or rented these body parts to researchers and medical facilities. All of this ostensibly legal. But from the beginning, IBI was sending up some red flags. The first one being that the neighbors who lived near the warehouse would complain about a really bad smell, and they were also concerned about seeing people coming in and out at all hours of the day and night carrying what looked to be trash bags. Now, when he would import body parts from overseas sellers, a lot of the times those would be flown in through New York. And New York actually has the strictest standards on human tissue. So twice the health inspectors in New York cited IBI for failure to provide documentation that the human remains were actually willingly donated. In 2010, he was questioned again about a shipment of 10 human heads flown in from Canada. Over the next 3 years, they documented 5 more international human remains shipments, including one that included a severed penis, but again, ostensibly legal. That is, until 2013, when a baggage handler at the Detroit Metro Airport noticed a box that looked like it was leaking blood. The baggage handler alerted the authorities, who came over and inspected it and determined that, yes, that was in fact blood. So they opened the package. Inside, they found a cooler, like, just a regular picnic cooler, filled with 8 human heads wrapped in trash bags. It would later be determined that one of those heads had belonged to someone who died of pneumonia and sepsis. Now, since the shipping of human remains is much more tightly regulated than the buying and selling of them, the Rathburns not having the proper paperwork for these heads finally brought them to the attention of the FBI. They raided IBI's warehouse in December of 2013, and the FBI agents described it as filthy, nasty, and disgusting. And here's where those with particularly weak stomachs should probably cover their ears. They found piles of dead insects on the floor, along with puddles of bodily fluids. They found body parts stockpiled in freezers, sometimes right next to food. Some of the body parts in these freezers had clearly thawed and then refrozen into one solid mass. They found other human remains in various states of decomposition, stored in ice chests. They found human heads stacked on shelves without anything in between them. And then in the cut room, as they called it, they found chainsaws, circular saws, and a sawzall that were used to dismember these bodies and not sterilized in between. In total, the FBI seized over 1,000 human body parts, including 4 preserved fetuses, from what the press was now calling the Warehouse of Horrors. But that's not the end of it. Paperwork found in IBI's offices exposed an entire network of illegal body part trafficking. In particular, Rathburn had purchased at least 26 heads from Biological Resource Center in Phoenix, which would eventually be indicted as one of his 2 co-conspirators to, quote, illegally collect, harvest, and traffic human remains. That place, Biological Research Center in Phoenix, deserves its own video. So let me know in the comments if you'd be interested in that. Anyway, Elizabeth, his wife, knew the old adage, the first one to squeal gets the deal. So she copped a plea deal where, in exchange for a sentence of only 9 months probation, she agreed to turn state's evidence. Elizabeth testified that she and Arthur would knowingly purchase diseased body parts at cut rates and then turn around and sell and rent those same body parts to surgical facilities and medical schools, claiming they were disease-free. Records show that some of these remains were infected with HIV, hepatitis, meningitis, sepsis, and all kinds of other diseases. This put the researchers and healthcare workers who used these remains at great risk. Also, when they didn't just outright forge the consent forms, they would lie to the families about what would be done with their loved ones' remains. Most of these families were really too poor to afford funeral services, so they jumped at the chance for a way to not only not be facing this huge expense, but also doing some good in the world, right? The Rathburns told the families that once the, quote, tissue had been removed for research, that they would receive the rest of their loved ones' cremated remains. Well, since there wasn't a whole lot, or sometimes anything, left of the cadaver after Arthur had parted it out, Elizabeth testified that the families would just get something else. Something else. When he was taken into custody in 2016, the former Grosse Pointe Park resident who had made $13 million from selling human body parts was homeless and living in his van. Even more bizarrely, while he was awaiting trial, he held a going out of business sale.
New tonight, the body snatcher accused of illegally selling body parts from a Detroit location held a going out of business sale.
People who had business dealings with this man telling Action News the same freezers he used to store arms, legs, and even heads were sold. Jeff Vaughn joins us tonight with the exclusive details on this one. Sounds crazy, Jeff.
Yeah, those electric freezers selling for just $50. Those smaller igloo coolers, sources tell me, selling for $10 a piece.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, in 2018, Rathburn was convicted of wire fraud and illegally transporting hazardous materials, and he was sentenced to 9 years in prison. He showed no remorse at his sentencing and just blamed the other body brokers for selling him diseased parts. Now, Rathburn's warehouse of horrors didn't really make much of an impact beyond Detroit, but in the wake of the resulting raid of his co-conspirator in Phoenix, again, deserves his own video, there's been some push to regulate this industry more. In 2019, Representatives Bobby Rush, a Democrat from Illinois, and Gus Bilirakis, a Republican from Florida, introduced the Consensual Donation and Research Integrity Act, which would create a registration and tracking system for body parts donated for research and would guarantee their respectful disposition when they were done being used. It was referred to the House Committee on Energy and Commerce, where it remains to this day. So, what are your thoughts on Arthur Rathburn's Warehouse of Horror, or about non-transplant tissue donation in general? And would you be interested in the story of his co-conspirator in Phoenix? Let me know in the comments. And as always, like and subscribe, and consider supporting me on Patreon. As you may have noticed by now, I use a lot of words and say a lot of things that YouTube does not like. It's really unlikely that any of my videos will ever be monetized. So the only way I can keep making them is with the generous support of my patrons on Patreon. So I've put a link in the description. Till next time, Darklings. And the tissue is tested and found to be free of they found other human remains. Elizabeth testified that she and Arthur would knowingly purchase. Elizabeth, I have to deal with my cat.